Hey guys, tonight we're heading somewhere warm, dusty, and just a little bit smoky. A medieval bakery where the air smells of flour, sweat, and ambition. You can almost feel the wooden paddle in your hands as you stand before the oven's open mouth, its orange glow flickering across your tired face. Outside, a rooster crows, not for you, but for the bakers who have already been awake for hours. This isn't the age of alarms or coffee. It's the age when bread quite literally keeps the world turning. You probably wouldn't survive a morning here. The heat alone would send you running for the nearest iced latte. But back then, no one had that luxury. Bakers were the quiet backbone of the medieval town, rising before the sun to knead the dough that would become breakfast, wages, and sometimes survival itself. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice is the sound. A steady rhythmic thump of fists hitting dough. The bakery sits on a narrow street lined with half-timbered houses that lean toward each other like old friends gossiping. Inside, the air hums with heat. The oven, built of thick clay and brick, devours firewood all night so it can roar to life by dawn. Flour hangs in the air like snow, coating everything, the bench, your apron, even the lashes around your eyes. You work beside two other bakers, men who've been doing this since their teens. There's not much conversation, just grunts and small sighs. The dough has to be mixed by hand, and by hand, we mean forearm deep in sticky elastic resistance that makes your muscles ache. There are no measuring cups or digital scales, just instinct. A handful of salt, a bucket of water, a sack of flour that might be wheat today or barley tomorrow, depending on what the miller sent. Bread here isn't just breakfast. It's the foundation of daily life. In medieval Europe, especially by the 13th century, people got up to 70% of their calories from bread. Poorer folks ate coarse loaves with bits of bran, grit, or even ground peas mixed in. The wealthy, of course, preferred fine white loaves, soft, clean, and utterly impractical for anyone doing real labor. And you, standing here, aren't just a baker. You're a kind of chemist, though you'd never call yourself that. You mix water and flour, let invisible yeast from the air find its way into the dough, and watch as the mixture slowly, mysteriously comes to life. Historians still argue whether medieval bakers really understood fermentation or simply trusted their senses. When the dough looked puffy and felt alive, it was ready. The town itself depends on you. Each morning, crowds will gather at your door. Peasants, merchants, even monks, all clutching coins and baskets. Bread is their main meal, sometimes their only one. A bad batch isn't just an inconvenience, it's a local disaster. And heaven help you if your loaves are too small. Because here's the twist. The size of a loaf isn't a matter of preference, it's law. There's a royal decree somewhere with your name on it, declaring exactly how heavy your bread should be for a certain price. Make it too light and you're a cheat. Too heavy and you'll go broke. It's a game of balance that defines your entire life. You glance outside. The sun is creeping over the rooftops now, washing the cobblestones in pale gold. A thin mist clings to the edges of the square, where the market is already stirring. A child chases a chicken past the door. A cart creaks under the weight of sacks of grain. Somewhere a bell rings for morning prayers. Your apprentice, a boy barely 12, is stoking the oven. Sparks rise like fireflies into the smoke hole above. You hand him a paddle and nod toward the first batch. Rough rounds of dough, cross-marked and dusted with flour. Each one looks identical, but you know better. Some will puff perfectly. Others will sag or burst, depending on how evenly the fire burns. It's strange, but in a world full of danger and chaos, plague, war, superstition, the bread feels like one thing you can control. Except you can't. The humidity changes daily, the flour shifts in quality, and sometimes the yeast just decides to take a day off. You've learned not to curse it. Just sigh, knead again, and hope the next batch behaves. The smell, though, never disappoints. It's deep and earthy, with notes of smoke and something faintly sweet. The scent that will draw townsfolk from streets away. Bread smells like home, even in a world that doesn't have the word comfort food yet. There's a quiet pride in your work. You don't wear armor, but your burns and calluses tell their own story. The perfect loaf. Crisp crust, soft crumb, right weight, isn't just about following rules. It's about proving that you can bring order out of chaos, that you can feed an entire neighborhood with nothing but hands, heat, and hope. And as the first loaves slide out of the oven, golden and steaming, the sun finally clears the rooftops. Your body aches, your clothes stick to your skin, but you can't help smiling. Another morning survived, another batch done. Soon, though, you'll have to face the market inspector, the man with the scale, the sharp eye, and no sense of humor. But that's tomorrow's problem. For now, you let the smell of warm bread fill the room, a promise that life, for at least one more day, will rise again. You step outside for a breath of air, though air might be generous. The scent of baking bread mixes with the wet musk of the cobbled street, a hint of horse manure, and the distant tang of the tannery down by the river. Still, for a few moments, it feels good to stretch your back and watch the morning unfold. The town is waking up, and you can sense its hunger in the air. Children tug at their mothers' sleeves, pointing toward your bakery door. Merchants, still rubbing sleep from their eyes, haggle half-heartedly with fishmongers. And somewhere, the church bells toll, not just for morning mass, but as a reminder of order, of routine, of rules that hold this fragile world together. You look down at the loaves cooling on the wooden racks by the window. Each one still steaming is more than food. It's currency. Bread here doesn't just fill bellies. It fills ledgers, pays debts, and sometimes settles scores. In many medieval towns, people used loaves instead of coins for small exchanges. A worker might be paid in bread. A servant might receive it as part of their wages. There were even towns where the local tax collector accepted a certain number of loaves per month instead of silver. You can't help but smile at the absurdity. Imagine paying your rent today with baguettes. But back then, it made sense. Bread was steady, valuable, and essential. As long as your oven worked and the grain arrived from the mill, you were a small but powerful piece of the town's economy. Of course, that also meant pressure. You could never bake enough. People depended on you, and not just for breakfast. Bread was the meal. It accompanied soups, stretched stews, and for the poor, often was the stew, chunks of stale bread soaked in whatever broth could be found. Historians still argue whether medieval bread was truly nutritious or just edible filler. Some say the coarser loaves, full of bran and husk, actually gave peasants more fiber and minerals than the polished white bread of the rich. Others argue it was just a polite way of saying, "It won't kill you, but don't expect joy." You pass a loaf to a familiar face, a cobbler, his hands dusted with leather scraps. He grins and places 2 small copper coins on the counter. No words are exchanged. Bread speaks for itself. Behind him comes a woman in a faded shawl. She's thin, her eyes darting toward the bread rack as though counting how much she can afford. You quietly cut a smaller piece. Underweight, maybe, but she doesn't complain. She tucks it close to her chest like treasure. Bread equals dignity. Losing access to it means losing your place in society. In famine years, people don't riot for gold. They riot for loaves. You've seen it before. Crowds shouting at bakers, accusing them of hoarding flour or cheating the scales. It's not always fair, but it's understandable. When the oven goes cold, the whole town shivers. You glance toward the guild hall across the street, where the baker's emblem, a sheaf of wheat and a rising sun, hangs above the door. It's supposed to protect you, a symbol of trust. But it also reminds everyone who's really in charge. Not the bakers themselves, but the authorities who fix prices, measure flour, and inspect your loaves with the precision of a miser counting coins. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rings again, this one sharper, less forgiving. It's the market bell, signaling the start of trade. Time to bring out the day's bread. You and your apprentice load baskets, careful not to bruise the crusts. You notice he sneaks a sniff every few seconds. The poor boy's probably half-starved himself. On the walk to the market, the streets grow busier. Horses snort, dogs chase scraps, and someone's shouting about stolen turnips. You find your usual stall beneath a crooked awning, set the baskets down, and start arranging the loaves. Round ones in front, long ones at the back. The customers come quickly. One man points at a loaf and frowns. "Looks smaller than yesterday," he mutters. You keep your voice calm. "Same weight, same flour." He squints, not convinced. People always think they're being cheated. You could bake a loaf twice the size, and they'd still poke it suspiciously. You know why. Bread is money, and no one trusts money. Especially not when kings and lords keep changing the rules. You've heard the stories. A decree 1 week, a new law the next. The price of bread shall match the cost of grain, they say. Easy words from people who've never burned a loaf in their life. Still, you play along. You nod politely, offer a replacement loaf, even smile. It's part of the trade. A baker's hands feed the town, but his patience keeps it peaceful. Sometimes, though, you wonder what would happen if one day you just stopped. If every baker shut their oven. If every mill stopped turning. Would the nobles finally notice the smell of hunger? Or would they just import bread from the next town over? You shake the thought away. You're not a philosopher, you're a baker. You work, you sweat, you feed. The rest is for priests and poets to argue about. A gust of wind lifts the scent of your loaves into the square. Heads turn. A small crowd gathers. Someone jokes that your bread smells better than their wife's cooking. You laugh, because laughter sells, and because it's true. The day stretches on. Coins clink, loaves vanish, and the baskets slowly empty. As you count the remaining bread, you realize something quietly satisfying. Each loaf is a promise fulfilled. Someone, somewhere, will sleep less hungry tonight because of your hands. And yet, in the back of your mind, the same thought returns. Was each loaf truly fair in weight? Because tomorrow, the inspector will come. And if even one is light, your reputation could crumble faster than stale crust. But for now, the square glows golden in the late morning sun. Pigeons coo from the rooftops. Children chase one another between stalls. And you lean against your cart, brush the flour from your arms, and breathe in the scent of bread. Your own quiet kind of wealth. The next morning arrives with the familiar crackle of firewood and the low hum of the oven warming to life. You can hear it breathing before you even open your eyes, a slow, steady hiss like a creature waking from sleep. The town outside still slumbers, but in your small bakery, the day has already begun its endless rhythm. You rub your eyes and step into the warm glow, the air already thick with flour dust. Your apprentice has arrived early, trying to impress you by lighting the oven before dawn. He's sweating and proud, though he's accidentally scorched a few scraps of yesterday's bread. You pretend not to notice. Today isn't just another day of baking. Today, the town crier will read the newest revision of the Assize of Bread and Ale, the royal law that decides the fate of every baker in the kingdom. You know what's coming. Another adjustment to the price, another rule you'll have to memorize, another reminder that your craft is not entirely your own. You step outside, the cool morning air wrapping around your flour-dusted clothes. The sound of the crier's bell echoes down the narrow streets, followed by his voice, nasal and sharp as a goose. By order of His Majesty's Council, the weight of a farthen loaf shall henceforth be. You tune out the numbers. They always change, depending on the price of wheat. The idea is noble, at least on parchment, to make sure people get fair bread, no matter what the market does. But in practice, it's chaos. Flour fluctuates daily. Ovens burn hotter or colder, depending on the wood. And sometimes the scales themselves can't be trusted. Still, you can't argue. The assize is law. It dates all the way back to 1266 in England, when Henry III's officials decided bakers needed regulation. If grain got expensive, loaves had to shrink. If grain got cheaper, loaves had to grow. The price stayed the same, but the size shifted like a living thing. You could almost say the bread itself breathed with the economy. You glance at your own loaves, cooling on the table, a dozen sturdy rounds with golden crusts. Each one will have to be weighed before it's sold. Not by you, of course. By the aliconers and bread weighers, the local inspectors whose entire purpose is to catch bakers who cheat by a few ounces. The irony doesn't escape you. Kings, knights, and lords might decide wars and borders. But the thing they legislate most fiercely is bread. Inside, your apprentice looks anxious. "Master," he says quietly, "what happens if the loaf is too light again?" You sigh. "If we're lucky, a fine. If we're not, the pillory." He swallows hard. Everyone knows the stories. The bread pillory, a wooden frame in the marketplace where dishonest bakers are locked in for all to see. Some are forced to hang their underweight loaves around their necks, a public warning that honesty weighs more than flour. You remember one poor soul in the next town over, a baker who thought he could stretch his grain with ground beans. The inspector caught him, and the townspeople pelted him with stale crusts for an entire afternoon, a humiliation that stuck longer than any fine. Historians still argue whether such punishments were truly common or just local legends passed down to scare apprentices like yours. Either way, the fear keeps everyone honest, or at least careful. You start to measure your loaves with your brass scale, a simple balance that's seen better days. Each side creaks as you add weights, the way a tired man might groan when rising from a chair. The first loaf passes. The second, not so much. It's 2 ounces light. You curse under your breath and tear off a piece from another loaf to even it out. Not elegant, but it'll do. There's something absurdly tender about this ritual. You're not just a baker. You're a mathematician of crumbs, a negotiator between law and hunger. You can feel the weight of responsibility in every loaf. Outside, the crier continues reading the new law to a few disinterested townsfolk. His voice drones on about fair measures, royal justice, and the dignity of trade. You know that behind his words lies something deeper. Fear. Fear of famine, of riots, of what happens when the price of bread tips too far for too long. You've seen it before. A bad harvest, a greedy lord, and suddenly your bakery becomes a battlefield. People pound on the door, demanding loaves you can't afford to give. You remember one winter years ago when the flour ran out entirely. You tried making bread with mashed beans and crushed acorns. The smell was fine. The taste, less so. Still, you learned something that year. Bread, even bad bread, is hope. A loaf in the hand is a promise that tomorrow might not be worse. Your apprentice interrupts your thoughts. "Master," he says, "how do you know when it's the right weight?" You look at him, smile faintly, and tap your temple. "When it feels right here." He frowns, thinking you're joking, but you're not. After years of kneading, shaping, and weighing, you can feel the difference by instinct, the way the dough springs back under your palm, the slight resistance when you lift it. It's something no rule book can teach. By mid-morning, the bread inspector himself arrives, tall, round, and already sweating through his wool coat. His assistant carries a ledger thick enough to stun an ox. They move from bakery to bakery like vultures, scratching notes, weighing loaves, muttering about fairness. When it's your turn, you offer your best loaf first. Always start with confidence. The inspector lifts it, squints, and grunts. Then comes the weighing. The scale tips slightly, but settles in your favor. A small victory. He nods once, approval without affection, and writes something in his book. You'll never know what. Maybe honest baker, maybe needs watching. As they leave, your apprentice exhales audibly. "We passed," he whispers. You smile, though you're too tired to celebrate. Tomorrow the law might change again. Tomorrow the grain might arrive late, or the fire might burn too hot. But for now, your loaves are legal, your conscience is clear, and your name stays off the pillory board. The town bell tolls again, this time for midday. The street smells of roasted onions and the faint sweetness of your cooling bread. You stretch your arms, brush flour from your hair, and laugh softly to yourself. Who would have thought survival could hinge on a few ounces of dough? The air tonight feels heavier than usual, sticky with the scent of flour and smoke. You're still in the bakery long after the market has closed. The shutters are drawn, and the last embers glow red inside the oven's mouth. Most bakers would have gone home by now, but you've stayed behind, cleaning the counter, sweeping the floor, and quietly counting coins under your breath. Because today, the numbers didn't add up. You sold nearly every loaf, but the profits don't match. The flour cost more this week, and the grain was damp when it arrived. You suspect the miller watered it down again, a trick as old as time itself. It makes the flour weigh more, but it also makes the dough weak, a sluggish, sticky mess that refuses to rise. You told him off last month, but he just grinned and said, "Water's free, my friend." It's not just water. You've heard of millers mixing chalk, sawdust, even powdered bones into the flour to stretch their yield. Flour fraud is a quiet plague in the Middle Ages. Everyone knows it happens, but no one wants to prove it. Because if you accuse a miller and you're wrong, you'll pay in more than coin. You sit by the table, rubbing your sore wrists. The apprentice has gone home, leaving you alone with your thoughts, and with the faint, unsettling creak of the building settling for the night. The candle flickers, throwing shadows across the walls. You pick up a handful of flour and let it run through your fingers. It looks pure, soft, innocent, but you know better. Flour can lie. There's a knock on the door. 2 quick taps, then silence. You sigh, already knowing who it is. The night watchman leans in, lantern swinging. "Evenin', baker," he says. "Heard you got some fresh loaves left over. My wife's expecting. Thought maybe—" You hand him one without a word. It's hard to be angry at a man who guards the streets for pennies. He nods, grateful, and slips away into the dark. You listen to his boots fade down the lane. You glance back at the oven, still faintly glowing, and remember a time when baking felt simpler, when the only enemy was a stubborn batch of dough. But now everything feels like a gamble. The price of grain, the mood of the inspectors, the honesty of millers, all of it affects whether your loaves will rise or your reputation will sink. Historians still argue whether medieval bakers truly faced ruin from such fraud, or if the stories have been exaggerated by later moralists who loved blaming millers for everything. But when you've seen a sack of flour that smells faintly of river water, you don't need a historian to tell you it's real. You push the thought aside and stand a stretch. The floor is warm beneath your feet, heated from the oven below. It's comforting in a way. The kind of warmth you don't have to think about. The kind that reminds you life still hums on quietly, even when the world outside feels uncertain. But not everyone in town sleeps easy tonight. The gossip spreads fast. Another baker, down by the river quarter, was caught selling loaves that weighed light. The inspector found sand in the dough. Real sand. You can't decide if that's bold or foolish. Either way, he's finished. You wonder what drove him to it. Maybe desperation, maybe pride. Sometimes the difference between fraud and survival is just who's telling the story. The thought stirs an uncomfortable memory. The year the harvest failed. The grain wagons never came, and people started grinding tree bark into flour. You remember the smell. Bitter, dry, wrong. You tried to bake with it once just to see. The dough came out gray and heavy as stone. Even rats wouldn't touch it. And yet, somehow, people lived through it. They ate roots, wild herbs, anything that could fill the emptiness. You can't help but admire that stubbornness. The same stubbornness that keeps you kneading dough day after day, no matter how much it fights back. A mouse scurries along the far wall, drawn by crumbs. You let it be. It's earned its share, same as you. You move back to the table and examine tomorrow's flour. You sift it through your hands, searching for grit. A few coarse flecks catch the candlelight. Could be sand. Could be husk. You decide not to know. Ignorance tonight feels merciful. You think of the guild, the baker's brotherhood that supposedly protects honest tradesmen like you. They talk big about purity and fairness, about keeping standards high. But behind closed doors, even guild members whisper about mixing fillers, about adjusting weights, about cutting corners, just a little. Everyone's afraid of falling short, and no one wants to be the next name on the pillory. You take a sip of ale, lukewarm and slightly sour, and lean against the doorframe. Outside, the moon hangs low over the rooftops, silvering the tiles. Somewhere down the lane, a baby cries. A dog answers. The town feels smaller at night, quieter, gentler, almost human again. You can almost convince yourself that all of this, the rules, the inspectors, the flour cheats, is just background noise. That what really matters is still simple. Mixing, shaping, baking. The rhythm of hands and fire. Still, a whisper of worry lingers. Tomorrow, you'll have to sell again. And if your flour is weak, your dough will sag. You'll be accused of dishonesty, even if the lie began at the mill. You laugh softly to yourself. Flour lies, but ovens don't. It's an old baker's saying, the kind passed down over mugs of ale when the fire burns low. The oven always tells the truth. It exposes weakness. It rewards patience. It punishes pride. You step closer to the heat, feel it against your palms, and watch the last ember collapse into ash. The bakery sighs, the same way you do. For now, it's enough to have survived another day without scandal. Tomorrow, though, tomorrow, you'll weigh every grain yourself. Morning comes slowly to the medieval town. You wake not to the sound of birds, but to the groan of the oven cooling and the faint hum of the street outside. Carts creaking, boots clattering on cobblestone, voices already trading gossip before sunrise. You sit up on the cot in the back room, rubbing the sleep from your eyes. The room smells of ash and stale flour. Not unpleasant, just lived in. You stretch your hands, the knuckles stiff and floored from yesterday. They ache in the same familiar way they always do. But that ache means you still have work, still have purpose. The first thing you do every morning isn't pray or eat. It's check the dough. You walk to the wooden trough, lift the cloth, and inhale. The yeast has done its work. A soft, slow rise, faintly sour and perfect for shaping. You can tell by the smell whether it's right. A good baker's nose is as sharp as any inspector's eye. Outside, someone shouting about fish again. It's always fish at this hour. Across the street, the fishmonger's cart clanks as he drops fresh-caught eels into a barrel of water. The whole quarter smells faintly of brine and smoke. You've gotten used to it. In a way, it mixes well with the scent of baking bread. The smell of life and sustenance, noisy and chaotic, but constant. You knead quietly, letting your mind wander. You think about the rules again, the ones that dictate everything you do. Bread isn't just food, it's regulation. The assize of bread, the guild's charter, the weight laws. It all keeps you inside invisible lines. The town needs bread, yes, but it also needs order. Once you thought rules made things fair. But now, after years of scraping flour from empty sacks, you know the truth. Rules mostly keep people scared. Still, you obey them. Mostly. You glance at the brass scale in the corner, the guild's official measure. Every loaf you sell must balance against the proper weight of silver coin. Too light, and it's a crime. Too heavy, and you're a fool. Somewhere between honesty and starvation lies the proper weight. You dust the counter with flour and begin shaping loaves, slow, deliberate motions. Each one feels like a prayer. Press, fold, turn, rest. You've done this so long, you could do it blindfolded. The apprentice stumbles in, yawning, hair still matted from sleep. "Morning, master," he mumbles. "Morning. Fire's out. Fetch kindling." He nods and starts gathering wood, his small hands clumsy but eager. You remember when yours looked the same. He speaks again as he works. "They say the baker by the bridge was fined yesterday. Something about underweight rolls." You grunt. He should have checked his scales. But you know it's rarely that simple. Sometimes the air itself steals weight. Humid mornings make loaves lighter. Sometimes customers complain just to earn favor from the inspectors. Everyone's always watching. By mid-morning, the oven's hot again, glowing red, breathing softly. You load the loaves one by one on the long wooden peel, sliding them deep inside the fire's throat. The heat stings your face, but it feels right, like standing in front of something ancient and honest. While the loaves bake, you lean on the wall, watching the street through the open shutter. The baker's life is half hidden, half public. Your work happens in private, but your product lives in everyone's mouth. You can tell what kind of day it'll be just by the tone of the street. Calm today, a few arguments, laughter near the well. Then you see her, the grain collector's daughter, walking toward the market square with a basket of records under her arm. She's young but sharp, known for keeping strict accounts. If the grain suppliers lie, she'll know. You nod slightly as she passes. She nods back, polite but distant. There's a rumor she's been taking notes on which bakers buy the cheapest flour. You can't tell whether that's meant as warning or temptation. The loaves crackle in the heat. You love that sound, the faint, brittle music of crust forming. You turn them carefully, watching for color. Dark crust means good strength, even heat. Pale means weakness. Bread doesn't lie. When you pull the first batch out, the smell fills the room, warm, nutty, alive. For a moment, all the worry about rules and weights fades. You break open a loaf, steam curling up, and hand a piece to the apprentice. He takes it reverently, eyes bright. "This is good," he says. You nod. Good bread doesn't need praise. He grins anyway, chewing thoughtfully. You can almost remember being that young, when bread still felt like magic instead of arithmetic. By noon, the bakery's busy again. Customers come in waves. The butcher's wife, 2 monks from the abbey, a soldier with a broken shoe, even the mayor's steward. You weigh, slice, sell, repeat. The rhythm blurs into comfort, until the door opens and the inspector steps in. He's tall, wrapped in a brown cloak with a ledger under his arm. You recognize him immediately. His presence is enough to quiet the room. Even the apprentice stops breathing. He doesn't smile. Inspectors never do. "Morning, baker," he says flatly. "Routine check." You nod and gesture to the loaves. "Fresh from the oven." He takes one, feels it, weighs it in his hand. "Smells honest," he mutters. Then he places it on his portable scale. The needle wavers, then settles, just above regulation. Safe. Still, he scribbles in his ledger. "Good," he says. "Keep it that way. The town's had too many cheats lately. You keep your tone even. I bake what I'm given." He looks up, eyes narrow. "Then pray you're given honesty." And with that, he's gone. You exhale slowly. The apprentice lets out a nervous laugh. You don't join him. Instead, you return to your bench and knead again, letting the motion drive out the unease. Because that's the secret truth every baker learns. You don't bake just to feed people. You bake to prove you're still part of the fragile trust that holds the town together. A trust measured in loaves, scales, and crumbs. As the sun climbs higher, you can almost believe it's enough. The afternoon drifts in quietly, like warm air through an open window. The morning rush is done. Every loaf sold, every crumb swept, every coin tucked into the small chest behind the counter. You stretch your back, bones clicking, and listen to the streets soften. Even the fishmonger has stopped shouting. For a brief moment, the world outside your bakery feels still. You take a seat on the low stool near the hearth. The oven's door glows faintly. Inside, the embers pulse like a sleeping heartbeat. There's peace in that rhythm. You've learned to measure your days by it, from spark to flame to ash. But as you rest, your thoughts wander back to the one thing that never truly sleeps. Your worry about the guild. The Bakers' Guild is supposed to protect people like you. That's what they tell everyone. Guardians of honest trade, they say. But what it really guards is control. Every rule, every fine, every ounce of flour is another thread in a web that holds you fast. You remember the last meeting vividly. A smoky hall filled with men whose hands, like yours, are always dusted white. They talk in circles, argue about prices, and sip weak ale, while the guildmaster, a round man with a ring of flour on his sleeves, reads out the new weight decrees from the town council. That day, you nearly spoke up, nearly asked why the new rules always seem to benefit the bigger bakeries, the ones that sell to nobles and monasteries, not to the people scraping by. But you didn't. You held your tongue, because bakers who talk too loudly tend to find their ovens accidentally inspected twice as often. Historians still argue whether guilds were truly protective brotherhoods or just medieval monopolies in disguise. From where you sit now, elbows on knees, you suspect the truth lies somewhere in between, a warm loaf with a bitter crust. You pick up a scrap of bread from the counter, one that broke during cooling, and nibble absent-mindedly. It's dense today, a little heavy, maybe too much rye in the mix. You'll note that for tomorrow. Outside, a soft knock at the door breaks the stillness. You look up. Standing there is a woman in a blue shawl clutching a basket of wheat stalks. You recognize her instantly. The widow from the edge of town. The one who brings you flour when the regular mills delay their deliveries. She steps in, brushing dust from her skirt. "You look tired," she says. You chuckle. "You look like someone who's carried a sack of grain uphill." She smirks. "I did. Twice." You trade a few pleasantries, then she sets the basket down. Inside are golden sheaves tied with twine, smaller than usual, but rich in color. "This season's yield isn't what it used to be," she admits softly. The fields near the river flooded again. You run a hand through the grain, letting the kernels slip between your fingers. They're light, too light. Still good enough for bread, you say, trying to sound confident. She tilts her head. Good enough, maybe, but not perfect. The words hit harder than they should. Perfect. The word every baker both loves and dreads. You've been chasing that ghost for years. The perfect loaf, the perfect rise. The perfect golden crust that no one can quite describe, but everyone claims to know when they see it. She leaves after a few minutes, and you sit there a while longer, staring at the basket. You know you'll have to mix that flour with something else to make it work. Perfection, after all, is often just clever blending. You think about the guild's obsession with perfection, the endless inspections, the standards written in Latin, so only half the bakers can even read them. It's strange, isn't it? How something as simple as bread, flour, water, salt, fire, can turn into a battlefield of pride and fear. You recall an old story told at the last fair about a baker in Bruges who was so obsessed with even loaves that he measured each one by string. When the weights failed, he blamed the humidity. When the string stretched, he blamed fate. Eventually, he stopped baking altogether because nothing ever matched the image in his head. They say he went mad and started counting clouds instead, because they were imperfect in perfect ways. You smile at the memory, though it's a sad one. Maybe all bakers go a little mad, chasing balance in a world that never stays still. The apprentice returns from the market, sweaty and cheerful. Master, the miller's son says the price of rye might rise again. Should we stock up? You sigh. We'll see. Bread isn't just baked, it's bargained. He nods, not quite understanding, and starts sweeping. You watch him for a while, the broom whispering across the floor. There's comfort in that sound, too. The soft repetition, the simplicity of motion. Evening begins to fall. You light the small oil lamp near the counter, its flame trembling like a nervous heartbeat. The street outside grows quieter. Children's laughter fades, replaced by the distant hum of church bells calling for vespers. You lean against the door frame, gazing at the fading light on the cobbles. The air smells of smoke and stew, a reminder that other people's dinners depend on your morning labor. It's humbling, in a strange way, to know that something as small as your loaf might be the warmest part of someone's day. And yet, as the lamp flickers, that word echoes again in your mind. Perfect. What if tomorrow's batch isn't perfect? What if the inspector returns? What if one loaf, just one, is too light? You shake your head, pushing the thought away. Perfection is a trap, you remind yourself. It's the same trap that drove the Bruges baker mad. Bread isn't meant to be flawless. It's meant to be alive. You close the shutters, bank the fire, and lie down once more on your cot. The smell of baked crust lingers in your hair, your clothes, even your dreams. In the half-darkness, you think of the guild's hall again, the way the flames there never seem to warm the room, the way the guildmaster's smile never reaches his eyes. You wonder if even he, with all his wealth and fine scales, ever sleeps soundly. Probably not. Because every baker, rich or poor, wakes with the same fear, that tomorrow's bread might fall flat. When dawn rolls in again, it carries a chill, the kind that seeps through stone walls and lingers in your bones, no matter how close you stand to the oven. You pull your cloak tighter and shuffle toward the counter. where yesterday's scales still sit like a pair of silent judges. Outside, the town stirs slower today, frost whitening the edges of every rooftop, the water troughs thinly iced over. You can hear the muffled clang of a faraway bell, the morning call for prayers, echoing between narrow streets. You move to the flour sacks, tugging one open. The widow's new grain looks different in daylight, paler, almost hesitant. You measure it carefully, mixing it with last week's stock. The air fills with that familiar dusty sweetness, the scent of promise and routine. But as you stir, you notice something odd. The dough doesn't feel right, too sticky, too stubborn. You add a handful of flour, then another. Still, it clings to your fingers like damp clay. You sigh, muttering to yourself. Some mornings, the bread just refuses to listen. That earns a sleepy chuckle from the apprentice. Maybe it's the cold, he says, rubbing his eyes. Maybe it's you counter, half smiling. He grins and gets to work stoking the fire. While he does, you catch your reflection in the iron peel, leaning against the wall. The flickering light makes your face look older than you remember. Deeper lines, flour tracing the edges like snow on a roof. You wonder briefly how many winters a baker gets before the heat of the oven feels heavier than the hunger of the town. You knead, pushing the dough harder than usual, until your shoulders burn. Then you leave it to rise and step outside to breathe. The morning air bites, but it's clean, crisp, and quiet. You glance down the lane where the Guildhall looms, its heavy door half open. Inside, you can hear voices, sharp, formal, and familiar. The kind of voices that mean business, not bread. You shouldn't care. You really shouldn't. But curiosity, like yeast, has a way of rising when left alone. You edge closer, pretending to adjust your flour sack. Through the gap in the door, you see 3 men seated around a table, the guildmaster, an alderman, and that same inspector from before. They speak in low tones, but you catch fragments. Weights, shortage, example. Your stomach tightens. You don't wait to hear more. You turn back to your shop, the sound of your own heartbeat louder than the morning bells. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's everything. Historians still argue whether guild crackdowns were about fairness or fear, whether the punishments protected consumers or merely kept bakers obedient. Standing here, you think it's both. A show of control disguised as justice. You close the bakery door behind you, letting the familiar scent of dough calm your nerves. The apprentice looks up. Everything all right? You nod. Everything's fine, just colder than usual. The oven's ready, heat shimmering from its mouth. You shape the dough carefully, not just with your hands, but with every ounce of memory and caution you've learned. Each loaf weighs the same, measured twice. You make sure of it. And yet, something in the air feels different, like the bread knows it's being watched. When the first batch comes out, the crust looks beautiful. A perfect fond, deep brown. You almost smile. Almost. Then you notice one loaf slightly smaller than the others. Barely noticeable, but enough to make your pulse quicken. You weigh it. The scale trembles. A single ounce too light. Just one. You can hide it. No one would know. But what if today's the day they check again? You stare at the loaf, then break it in half. Steam curls out like a sigh. You toss the pieces into the waste barrel. Perfection or nothing, you whisper, though you don't know whether you mean it anymore. The apprentice blinks. It looked fine to me. You shake your head. Fine isn't always safe. As the day passes, rumors spread like yeast in warm water. Another baker fined. Another accused of mixing sawdust into dough, though everyone knows that's just gossip from the butcher's wife. The guild has announced new inspections to maintain standards. You know what that means. Fear baking into every crumb in town. That evening you visit the tavern near the square, not for drink, but for talk. The fire there always burns bright, and the benches are full of tradesmen swapping complaints. You take a seat beside the cooper, who nods. You heard, he says. Guild's planning to post the names of every fine baker on the church door. Like sinners' lists. You groan softly. Next they'll have us confessing to our loaves. He laughs, a short, bitter sound. Wouldn't be the worst sin in this town. The two of you share a stale roll and a few quiet minutes of camaraderie. You don't need to talk much. Everyone here understands the same struggle. As you leave, a snowflake drifts past your face. You look up, the first of the season. It melts on your cheek before you can even feel it. Winter has come, and with it, the hardest months for bread. Back at the bakery, the apprentice has fallen asleep by the fire, flour on his cheek like war paint. You drape a cloth over him and sit at the counter, alone again with your thoughts. You think of that perfect loaf you threw away, 1 ounce too light. Would anyone have noticed? Would it have mattered? Maybe perfection isn't about rules at all. Maybe it's about trust between you and the people who eat what you make. A trust no guild can measure or fine. But then again, try telling that to an inspector. The fire pops softly, and for a brief, drowsy moment, you imagine the town asleep. Every home warmed by the bread you baked, every dream faintly scented with yeast and ash. Maybe that's enough perfection for one night. Morning sneaks in under the shutters again, thin and silver. You wake before the first bell, like always, body already tuned to the rhythm of the oven. The apprentice still snores softly in the corner, a luxury you no longer have. You sit up, rubbing your wrists, and listen to the faint crackle of embers still alive from last night. The smell of cooling ash mingles with something faintly sweet, honey maybe, from the loaves you brushed before dawn. It's a comforting scent, the kind that makes the world feel momentarily kind. Then a knock. It's not the soft kind, not a customer or the widow with grain. This one is sharp, official. Your pulse quickens as you open the door. Standing there are 2 men in heavy cloaks. One you recognize instantly. The inspector again, flanked this time by a young clerk holding a wax tablet. The inspector doesn't waste words. By order of the Bakers' Guild and Town Council, all ovens will be measured today for fair heat and capacity. You blink. Measured? He nods curtly. We've had inconsistencies reported. You step aside, trying to keep your expression neutral. The apprentice stirs, sensing trouble. The inspector paces through your bakery like a man surveying a battlefield. He touches everything, the scales, the flour trough, the fire rake, as if each object hides a secret. The clerk scribbles furiously, noting every gesture. Your oven, the inspector says finally, looks older. You shrug. It bakes well enough. He crouches, running a hand along the soot-blackened arch. Some bakers, you know, secretly modify the chamber. Smaller space, quicker heat, more loaves in less time. Unfair advantage. You stare at him. If I had an unfair advantage, I wouldn't still owe the miller money. The clerk's quill hesitates mid-scratch, but the inspector doesn't smile. Just if you must, he says. But this is serious. He motions for you to light the oven. You do, stacking kindling and sparking flint. The flame catches slowly, reluctant in the damp air. The inspector watches like a hawk, eyes narrowing at every creak. When the fire's steady, he places a small metal rod inside, a heat gauge of sorts, crudely forged but intimidating in its simplicity. We'll return in an hour, he says. If the reading's wrong, you'll know. He leaves without another word, boots clattering on the cobbles. The clerk trails after him, looking half frozen. You stand there, watching the flame dance. An hour, you think. 1 hour to wait and wonder if the oven that's fed this town for 20 years will now be judged unfit. The apprentice breaks the silence first. Master, what happens if— Don't, you interrupt gently. It'll be fine. But you don't believe it. Not entirely. Historians still debate whether medieval trade inspectors were motivated by public duty or by the quiet thrill of power. Some say they were honest. Others, that they pocketed bribes between measures. Whatever the truth, you can feel the imbalance, like scales forever tipping toward someone else's favor. You stoke the fire higher, feeding it more wood than usual. The heat builds, a slow roar filling the small room. Sweat beads on your forehead despite the frost outside. Too hot, the apprentice murmurs. Better too hot than too cold, you reply. The hour stretches thin. You sit, stand, sit again. Every creak of wood sounds like footsteps returning. You start to imagine the inspector's face again, that thin smile that never quite reaches his eyes. You picture him peering into your oven, pronouncing it faulty, closing your shop. Finally, the door opens. He's back, brisk and silent. The clerk follows, already poised with his tablet. The inspector removes the rod, studies it closely, then frowns. You can't breathe. He says nothing for a long moment. Then, acceptable. Just that one word. You almost laugh, but it comes out as a shaky exhale. He marks something in his ledger, nods once, and turns to leave. But at the door, he pauses. You should know, he says over his shoulder. The guild will be setting a public demonstration next month, a contest of loaves. The most consistent baker will be named master of weight and crust. You arch an eyebrow. A contest? We're bakers, not knights. Consider it a chance to prove your honesty, he replies. Then he's gone, leaving the scent of damp wool and authority behind. The apprentice looks thrilled. A contest. Maybe we'll win. You don't share his enthusiasm. The thought of baking for judges, of your livelihood paraded like sport, makes your stomach twist. But you can't show that. We'll see, you say, forcing a small smile. First, we have real bread to make. The rest of the day passes in uneasy quiet. The townsfolk whisper about the contest, how it might bring fame or ruin, depending on who's chosen. The guild calls it a celebration of trust. You call it theater. As you knead the next batch of dough, your hands move automatically, muscle memory guiding them while your mind drifts. What does perfect bread even mean? Is it weight, color, texture, or something softer, the comfort people feel when they smell it baking? You recall a saying your mentor once told you, bread is honest, but people are not. You didn't understand it then. Now it's all too clear. By evening, the fire is low again. You wipe the counter clean, flour ghosting through the air like fog. Outside, snow falls steadily, blanketing the cobbles. silencing even the rowdiest merchants. You look at the oven, the same one that's been measured, judged, and declared acceptable. And somehow, that single word feels smaller than it should. Acceptable isn't perfect. It isn't even praise. It's permission to keep working. Still, it's enough. You bank the fire, close the shutters, and whisper to the empty room, "Tomorrow, we'll bake better." And the oven, as if it understands, lets out one last soft crackle before the night takes it. The following week begins with rumors thick as flour dust. Everyone in the market talks about the coming guild contest, some with excitement, others with dread. The mayor calls it a chance to showcase civic pride. The millers call it a gimmick. The butchers predictably just laugh. For you, it's an itch that won't go away. Every time you knead dough or adjust the oven's heat, the thought returns. What if I enter? It sounds foolish. You've spent decades feeding the same faces, weary farmers, fishwives, children with crumbs on their cheeks. They already know your bread. They don't need proof. But deep down, you can't ignore the idea that maybe, just maybe, you want to be seen again. Not as the old baker with the crooked wrist, but as someone who once mastered fire and flour. So you begin to prepare, quietly. You rise earlier. You test new ratios, new folds. You notice the small things again. How a wetter dough sings faintly when the yeast wakes. How salt changes not only flavor, but the very rhythm of kneading. The apprentice watches, learning in silence, perhaps sensing that something important is unfolding. One morning, while measuring the first batch, he asks, "What will you make for the contest?" You think for a long moment. "The same bread we always make, just better." He looks confused. "But won't others do fancy ones? Honeyed loaves or saffron bread like the guild likes?" You smile faintly. "Let them chase gold. Ours will taste like home." It becomes your quiet mantra. Taste like home. Historians write that medieval guild contests often became less about skill and more about spectacle, a display of hierarchy disguised as craftsmanship. The wealthiest bakers flaunted rare spices and gilded crusts, while smaller ones tried to impress with novelty. But the true masters, they say, never showed off. They simply baked bread that fed the town, and hearts remembered it long after. You try to be one of those. Each night the apprentice collapses from exhaustion. You stay up longer, testing cooling times, listening to the crusts sing as they crackle in the dark. You record nothing, but you feel everything. How the dough tightens beneath your hands, how each loaf carries a heartbeat. The contest day creeps closer. On the morning before it, the inspector returns, again unannounced. He doesn't even bother knocking this time. "Preparations going well?" he asks, scanning your shelves. "As well as they can," you answer. He walks closer to the oven, trailing a gloved hand across the edge. "Strange thing, contests. They bring out both pride and fear. Some bakers bribe judges, you know. Others sabotage ovens." You meet his eyes. "And what do you do, Inspector?" He hesitates, then chuckles softly. "I watch." You can't tell if that's a warning or a confession. After he leaves, the bakery feels colder. You glance at the oven, your oldest ally, your fiercest critic, and whisper, "Let's show them." The contest takes place in the square, under the shadow of the cathedral. The air smells of smoke and yeast, and the whole town buzzes like a hive. Bakers line up their loaves on long wooden tables. each one marked with a carved sigil. Yours sits among them, a simple round loaf, dusted lightly with flour, its crust golden and quiet. It looks modest beside the others. There's one glazed with honey, another braided with almonds, one even studded with raisins soaked in imported wine. The judges approach. The inspector is among them, his eyes unreadable. The first loaf, the honeyed one, earns murmurs of approval. The second, too sweet. The third, impressive but hollow inside. When they reach yours, no one speaks for a long moment. One judge slices through the crust, listens to the crackle. He smells it, then takes a bite. Something soft shifts in his expression. This, he says quietly, is bread that remembers people. It's an odd phrase, but in that moment it feels like a kind of benediction. They move on, but you hardly notice. You stand there, surrounded by the murmur of townsfolk, the scent of your own bread mingling with hundreds of others. And for the first time in years, you feel seen. Later, the results are announced. You don't win first place. That honor goes to a wealthy baker from the merchant district. His loaf glittered with egg wash and flakes of gold. The crowd cheers dutifully. But when the inspector calls your name for craft of heart, an honorary title no one expected, something strange happens. The applause feels warmer, realer. The apprentice beams. "Master, you did it!" You shake your head slowly. "No," you say, watching the crowd. "We did." That night, back in the bakery, the fire burns low again. You sit beside it, too tired to move. The metal, a simple pewter disc, rests on the table, already smudged with flour. You stare at it for a long while, then push it aside. It's the loaves cooling on the rack that matter. The ones for tomorrow's breakfast. The real work. The apprentice asks softly, "Will you keep it? The metal?" You shrug. "Maybe, but it won't keep the oven warm." He laughs, and the sound feels like a promise that the work will go on, the bread will still rise, no matter who wins contests or signs ledgers. Outside, snow begins again, falling steady and silent. Inside, the last crusts sing as they cool. A quiet, contented whisper of heat fading into night. You close your eyes, letting the rhythm of the cooling bread lull you toward sleep. And somewhere between the crackle of embers and the sigh of falling snow, you think, this is enough. The following months pass like a slow winter thaw. Quietly, almost imperceptibly. The contest fades into a half-remembered story told by customers while waiting for their morning loaf. The pewter metal hangs forgotten on a beam, now dulled by flour dust. You don't polish it. You don't need to. But something has changed. Not in the market or in the guild halls, but in you. You've begun to notice the world differently. The way the morning light hits the rising dough. How each loaf seems to carry its own small spirit. You still measure, knead, and bake, but with a kind of tenderness that wasn't there before. Maybe it's age. Maybe it's wisdom. Or maybe after decades of chasing the perfect loaf, you're finally realizing what that word actually means. You think about the crust often, that first golden armor that seals everything within. You remember how you once fretted over every crack, every blister. Now, when a loaf emerges uneven, you just smile faintly. It reminds you that even imperfection can feed a town. Still, the obsession never fully disappears. Perfection, after all, isn't a finish line. It's a horizon that keeps moving just as you approach it. Historians note that medieval bakers shared that same quiet madness. In the absence of thermometers, timers, or digital scales, they relied on instinct. The color of smoke, the weight in their palms, the sound of the crust when tapped. It was less science than poetry, yet somehow it worked. Their loaves fed empires, soldiers, and saints alike. One fringe tidbit suggests that certain master bakers even listened to their bread by placing an ear against the cooling crust, swearing they could tell by the sound whether the dough had been kneaded long enough. Scholars debate if this was superstition or sensitivity, but you decide it doesn't matter. You've done it yourself, haven't you? Tonight, you find yourself doing it again. The apprentice has gone home, the streets are silent, and the bakery hums with the fading warmth of the oven. You take one of the fresh loaves from the rack, hold it to your ear, and listen. There it is, the faint crackle, like rain on parchment. You close your eyes. That, you whisper, is the sound of life continuing. You start thinking more about why you became a baker in the first place. Not for medals, not for guild approval, but because of that sound, that smell, that moment when the world feels held together by crust and crumb. Once, when you were an apprentice yourself, your old master told you, "A perfect crust is just a reflection of a steady heart." You thought it was nonsense back then. Now you understand. Bread, like people, doesn't rise without tension. Too loose and it collapses. Too tight and it cracks. The trick is balance, to hold just enough pressure for growth. One day, a traveling monk enters your bakery. His robes are tattered, his sandals muddy, but his smile is kind. He watches you work for a while, then says, "Your bread smells like mercy." You laugh. That's a strange thing to say. He shakes his head. No stranger than the truth. I've eaten bread that tastes of greed, of fear, of hurry. Yours tastes like someone waited. You have no reply. The words linger long after he leaves, like the scent of fresh loaves cooling in air. That night, you can't sleep. You sit by the fire, mulling over what he said. Maybe that's what makes bread perfect. Not its symmetry, but its patience. Historians still argue, you recall reading once, whether medieval artisans saw their crafts as art or obedience. Some say bakers were practical men, answering hunger with skill. Others insist they saw divine meaning in the rise of dough, proof, quite literally, of life from nothing. You lean toward the second camp, because how else can you explain that quiet satisfaction when a loaf emerges exactly right, golden, fragrant, alive? It's as though the universe momentarily agrees with you. Over time, word of your bread spreads again. Merchants stop by, pilgrims too. They don't know about your medal or the contest or the inspector. They just know your loaves make mornings feel steadier. The apprentice, now older, has begun taking over more work. You watch him knead, eyes narrowed, shoulders steady, and you see pieces of yourself there, both the ambition and the calm. He doesn't need constant correction anymore. You just nod when he gets it right, and he beams like the first sunrise of summer. Sometimes, when you pass the rack, you pause to admire the row of cooling loaves. The crusts glisten faintly, each one a universe of tiny imperfections. You think, they're perfect. Then you correct yourself. They're enough. A few weeks later, the inspector visits again. Older now, a little slower. You share tea, no talk of fines or weights, just quiet respect. You've mellowed, he observes. You grin. Or maybe I finally learned what's worth weighing. He chuckles, gazing at the loaves on the table. Funny, isn't it? All that trouble over a few ounces, as if perfection could be measured. You nod. It can't, but we still try. He looks thoughtful. Maybe that's the point. When he leaves, you watch him disappear into the misty street, his steps soft, fading. You realize you'll probably never see him again. But for once, it doesn't feel like loss, just another cooling loaf in the grand oven of time. Later that night, you sit by the window, watching the moonlight fall across the flour-dusted counter. You feel a stillness settle in your chest, not the restless hunger for better, but the gentle peace of having baked enough to last a lifetime. Outside the town sleeps, bell towers silent, chimneys exhaling the last smoke of the day. You close your eyes, and in your dreams you hear that familiar sound again, the soft crackle of crust cooling, the whisper of perfection letting go. And you understand, the search was never for the perfect loaf. It was for the quiet heart that could let it be. The market smells different when the women arrive. You notice it before sunrise. The faint perfume of wild herbs tucked into aprons, the damp straw from baskets, the rhythmic chatter that fills the air like bird song before dawn. They move with quiet certainty, these women of the oven, and though no one officially calls them bakers, you know better. They've always been here. You see them kneeling by small hearths, hair tied back with scraps of linen, hands dusted in flour that glows pale under the first light. Some bake for the household, others for the entire street. The men of the guilds may hold the licenses and stamps, but it's the women who keep the dough alive. In medieval towns, many widows were granted permission to bake as a form of survival. The widow's loaf, they called it. Historians still argue whether these permissions were acts of mercy or simply clever economics. Either way, those women turned grief into bread. One such widow works near you. Her name's Alice. She bakes in a small clay oven outside her home, where pigeons peck at stray crumbs and her cat curls under the bench. You sometimes catch her humming while she works, a lilting tune that somehow makes the bread rise just right. She never weighs her loaves. She judges by touch alone, and somehow her bread always sells out before noon. Trade secret? You once asked her, teasing. Patience, she said, smiling, and a clean conscience. You laughed at the time, but the words stuck with you longer than the smell of rye. The guildmen don't like her much. She doesn't belong to their circle, doesn't pay their dues, yet her customers adore her. She doesn't advertise or hang fancy signs. She just shows up, morning after morning, sleeves rolled high, face lit by the oven glow. Historians suggest that such women, though rarely recorded in ledgers, made up nearly half the real baking workforce in certain towns. Their names are lost, their ovens unmarked, but their bread fed entire generations. A quirky tidbit survives in an old English statute. Women bakers, especially those unlicensed, were sometimes accused of selling short-weight loaves by charm or chant. In other words, officials suspected them of witchcraft when their bread turned out better than the men's. You can't help but smile at that. Of course, if a woman could bake well without scales, the only explanation must have been magic. You picture Alice laughing if she'd heard that, wiping her hands on her apron, eyes sparkling with amusement. "If good bread is witchcraft," she'd say, "then I confess." One morning she asks if you'll carry a sack of flour for her. You do, gladly. Her home smells of roasted chestnuts and yeast, warm and honest. On the table sits a row of loaves, each a slightly different shape, none perfect, all beautiful. "You don't use the guild stamp," you remark. "I don't need to," she says. "People know my bread." And they do. Children run to her stall with pennies. Old men trade stories for a crust, and even the town guards sneak bites during their patrols. Her bread doesn't just feed, it connects. You realize, watching her work, that the pursuit of perfection you've obsessed over all your life was only half the story. She's chasing something else entirely. Belonging. Later that week, you hear the guild is sending inspectors again, targeting unlicensed bakers. You warn her, but she only shrugs. "They'll find me," she says. "Then I'll bake more bread to pay it." Her defiance feels soft, almost tender. Not rebellion, but resilience. When the inspectors arrive, their boots heavy with authority, she doesn't hide. She stands by her oven, wiping her hands calmly, waiting. They weigh her loaves, frown, scribble something, and leave. No shouting, no scene. That night, you see her selling as usual, the same calm rhythm as ever. You ask how it went. "They said my bread was an ounce too light," she says, chuckling, "but one of them bought 2 anyway." You both laugh until your ribs ache. Historians still argue whether the rise of female bakers marked empowerment or desperation. You recall reading once, "Were they pioneers or survivors of a system stacked against them?" Maybe both, because when you look around, you see that the bread of the town, its daily comfort, mostly comes from their hands. Their stories might not be written in the official guild books, but their fingerprints are everywhere. In the dough, the ovens, the warmth that lingers after every meal. One evening, a storm rolls in. The streets empty. Shutters slam. You see Alice struggling to keep her fire lit, the wind howling through her alley. Without thinking, you grab a spare plank and help her shield the oven. Rain hisses on the coals, steam rises, and for a moment you're both laughing, soaked through, trying to protect something fragile and glowing. When it's done, when the fire finally steadies, she presses a warm loaf into your hands. "For your trouble," she says. You tear off a piece. It's still soft, the crust thin but crisp, and you can't help but close your eyes at the taste. Smoky, sweet, real. "You know," you murmur, "it's perfect." She laughs softly. "No, just enough." You recognize your own words mirrored back at you, and it warms you more than the bread itself. As the storm fades, you walk home under dripping eaves, carrying the loaf like a small treasure. The air smells of rain and yeast, 2 things that always promise renewal. You think of all the nameless women who kept towns like this alive, feeding soldiers, priests, children, strangers, all while being told their work didn't count. You decide that if perfection exists anywhere, it's there, in quiet hands that give more than they keep. Tomorrow, you'll bake again. You'll stamp your loaves, weigh them carefully, meet the guild's expectations. But somewhere deep down, you'll remember her laugh, her calm, her storm-proof fire. And maybe when the dough feels stubborn, you'll hum her little tune, just to see if it helps. The guild hall smells like smoke wax, and self-importance. You know that scent all too well. The building looms near the town square, its beams blackened with age, banners fluttering faintly in the draught. Once you entered this hall trembling, an apprentice clutching a letter of introduction. Now, as a seasoned baker, you cross its threshold with cautious familiarity. Not fear, not quite pride, something in between. Inside, the guild masters sit in a semicircle, their robes thick with starch and flour dust. A fire crackles behind them, as if to remind everyone who controls the heat in this city. On the long table lies the ledger, where every licensed baker's name is written in looping ink. It's more than a list. It's a passport to legitimacy, protection, and taxes. You sign your name again for renewal, your quill scratching softly. Around you, other bakers do the same, mostly men, but a few women too now, sitting straighter than they did last year. The guild is changing slowly, like dough left overnight to rise under a heavy cloth. The master warden clears his throat. "We gather," he says solemnly, "to maintain the standards of our craft, for the good of the people and the glory of God." You hide a smile. That phrase never changes. Once upon a time, bakers were seen as humble tradesmen, little more than servants to appetite. But as towns grew, so did the power of bread. A bad harvest, a bad batch, or a rumor of cheating could spark riots. Guilds formed to bring order, or control, depending on who you ask. Historians still argue whether these guilds protected bakers or just protected profits. Some call them early unions, others early monopolies. Either way, by the late 14th century, a loaf couldn't legally change hands in many towns unless the guild approved. You remember the early days, the pride of earning your guild seal, the way it felt like being knighted with a wooden spoon instead of a sword. The guild promised fairness, regulation, respect. But over time, the lines blurred. Rules multiplied like mice in the pantry. New fees appeared for market upkeep, flour purity tests, oven maintenance dues. It became clear that while bread fed the people, bureaucracy fed itself. Still, you can't deny what the guild offered: fellowship, the sense that you weren't alone in this exhausting, beautiful craft. Once a month you'd meet to share ale, stories, and occasional grievances. Someone always complained about inspectors. Someone else always bragged about crust thickness. You all pretended not to care, yet deep down you did. Those gatherings often ended with songs, not hymns, but work songs, half drunk and half true. You remember one verse that always made everyone laugh. "If your loaf be light, pray weigh your sin, for God and guild shall measure in." You never wrote it down, but you still hum it when you scrub the table at night. There's another reason the guild mattered: lineage. A baker's son could inherit his father's trade. Apprentices could rise through ranks, become journeymen, then masters. It was a ladder carved from flour and sweat, but it was yours to climb. Your first apprentice, Thomas, now stands in front of you at the meeting. He looks nervous, hands clasped, face flushed. You remember when his kneading looked more like punching, when he burned the first 3 batches beyond recognition. Now his loaves are golden, dependable, even elegant. When his name is called, you nod encouragingly. The warden stamps his parchment with the guild seal, a sheaf of wheat crossed with a rising sun. He's official now. The look of pride in his eyes makes you feel older and lighter all at once. After the meeting, you hand him a mug of ale. "Welcome to the Brotherhood," you say. He grins. "Do I get a raise?" You laugh so hard you nearly spill your drink. "You get less sleep? That's a real promotion." Later that night, as you walk home under the flickering lanterns, you think about how many bakers have come and gone through these streets. Thousands of them, each chasing the same invisible standard, each stamping their seal onto dough that would vanish by morning. Bread is temporary, but the act of making it binds generations together like unseen yeast. You pass by Alice's stall. It's empty now, but the smell of her bread lingers. She's not in the guild, never will be, yet her influence feels just as strong. The guild may have the records, but she has the hearts. Historians still argue whether guilds were the birth of professionalism or the death of creativity, you recall. Maybe both again. Regulation gives safety, but also walls. And yet, you understand the balance now. The guild hall and the widow's oven are two sides of the same loaf. Order and intuition, rules and rhythm, control and grace. You can't bake without both. The next morning, you open your bakery earlier than usual. Thomas arrives soon after, yawning but smiling. Together you prepare the dough in silence. That comfortable kind of silence where words would only get in the way. As you knead side by side, you realize that the guild seal on your wall, the one polished every year for inspection, doesn't matter nearly as much as this moment. Two pairs of hands shaping something from nothing. The guild may pass resolutions, kings may set prices, but bread still rises the same way, through patience, warmth, and touch. You glance at the rows of raw dough resting under linen. They look peaceful, almost asleep. You whisper softly, "All right, you lot, time to rise." It's half a joke, half a prayer. When Thomas laughs, you feel the same spark you did as an apprentice. The sense that this craft, despite all its rules and arguments, is still a kind of magic. And maybe, you think as the first batch bakes, the guild isn't just about control. Maybe it's humanity's way of saying, we care enough to make the same thing together, over and over, for centuries. The hall, the laws, the taxes, they're just scaffolding. The real guild lives here, in the warmth between people, in the quiet respect passed down like a well-worn recipe. You dust flour off your hands, inhale the scent of rising loaves, and smile. The brotherhood of bakers, imperfect, noisy kind, endures. You never meant to become a scientist, but somewhere between the early dawns and the late-night cleanups, you realize you've spent your whole life running experiments, just with fewer notes and more crumbs. Every morning you perform the same rituals, measuring, mixing, resting, waiting. To outsiders, it looks like routine. To you, it's closer to alchemy. You lean over the bench, fingers deep in a soft mass of dough. The smell is familiar. Slightly sour, faintly nutty, alive. Yes, alive. Because that's the secret everyone forgets. Dough breathes. It expands, exhales, sighs. The air inside it hums like a heartbeat if you listen closely enough. Long before anyone could spell fermentation, medieval bakers understood it by instinct. They might not have known the word yeast, but they knew its behavior better than any textbook ever could. If it sleeps too long, your old master used to say, you wake it with warmth. If it rushes ahead, you calm it with cold. It was like tending a child, firm when needed, gentle otherwise, Historians still argue whether these early bakers discovered fermentation accidentally or intentionally. One camp insists it began when someone forgot dough in a warm corner overnight. Another suggests that natural leavens were carefully cultivated from the start. Either way, the results spoke louder than any chronicle could. Bread stopped being a hard disk of survival and started to become something miraculous, soft, fragrant, and forgiving. You think of your own first attempts with wild yeast. Back then, you didn't call it levain or starter. You called it the jar. You'd feed it flour and water and pray it wouldn't die. Sometimes it smelled faintly like apples, other times like regret. You've lost count of how many starters you've buried in the compost behind the bakery. But the one that survived, the one bubbling quietly in the corner now, has been alive longer than some royal marriages. There's a kind of intimacy to that relationship. You talk to the dough, even when no one's around. You press a finger in and whisper, "Not yet," or "Good job, old friend." Maybe it's superstition, maybe it's science with personality, but somehow the bread listens. A curious tidbit floats through your memory. In 13th century Paris, certain bakers were rumored to swear oaths to their starter. If a loaf failed, they'd apologize to it aloud, promising to do better next time. You chuckle at the image, a burly man kneeling before a jar of bubbling goo like it's a tiny god. And yet, as you stir your own starter with care, you realize you're not so different. Science and superstition often overlap when knowledge is thin and wonder is thick. You might not believe in magic, but you believe in transformation, and that's close enough. Thomas, your apprentice, watches you measure the water with almost reverent precision. Why does temperature matter so much, he asks. Because bread is stubborn, you say. Too cold and it sulks. Too hot and it panics. He laughs. Like people, then. Exactly. You hand him a lump of dough, warm and elastic. Go on, feel it. Tell me what it wants. He kneads cautiously, then nods. It wants to rest. You grin. Then so do we. There's no thermometer in your bakery. No precise tools. You test heat by instinct, the way your palm hovers near the oven's mouth, reading invisible temperatures. A good baker, you remind Thomas, doesn't need numbers, he needs nerves. That line always earns a groan, but he remembers it. The medieval oven is a fickle friend. You burn your arms, you guess timings by the smell of smoke. You pray the coals behave. Every loaf is a lesson in physics disguised as patience. You learn to watch how steam escapes from cracks, how the crust blisters, how the sound of the oven shifts when it's ready. Historians today can describe medieval ovens in meticulous detail. The domed clay walls, the heat retained by bricks, the embers swept aside before baking. But what they can't capture is the feeling. The way the air trembles when you open that iron door. How the rush of warmth brushes your face like the breath of something ancient. You've always wondered what made humans fall in love with bread. Out of all the ways to consume grain, boiled, pounded, chewed, why this? Why the act of coaxing bubbles into flour? Some scholars argue it's because bread bridges the gap between control and chaos. We shape it, yet it decides how much to rise. You can't rush it, and you can't command it. You can only partner with it. You smile at the thought. Bread is a dance partner. Who'd have guessed? Still, mistakes happen. Too much salt once. Too little water another time. Once you even baked with ashes by accident. because a wind blew the soot back in. Toma couldn't stop laughing for days. But the beauty of bread lies in forgiveness. Even a flawed loaf can nourish. It might not be perfect, but it's alive. Later that week, you overhear two scholars debating outside the church. One insists yeast was divine proof of creation, life from dust. The other claims it was just chemistry, invisible creatures feasting on sugar. You don't know who's right, and honestly, you don't care. To you, it's both. Bread proves that life thrives in warmth, discipline, and time. The irony isn't lost on you. Centuries before microscopes, bakers were running biological experiments every single morning, guided only by smell and touch. They didn't need Latin names for yeast to respect its moods. Historians still argue, you muse aloud, whether knowledge starts in the mind or the hands. But you already know your answer. Hands came first. Night falls. You check your dough one last time before bed. The bakery hums with residual heat. The air smells faintly of fermentation and pine smoke. You run your fingers along the bench, smooth from years of kneading, and whisper, "See you in the morning." Outside, the moon glows like a cooling loaf. Somewhere, Alice is probably still awake, her small oven crackling, her song drifting through the alleys. Thomas sleeps upstairs, dreaming of rising dough. You pause, feeling the quiet pulse of your craft around you. The science of bread isn't written in books, but in gestures, in every fold, every weight, every sigh of a loaf that's finally done enough. Tomorrow, you'll start again. You always do. Morning comes slowly with that kind of blue-gray light that slips through cracks before the sun itself appears. You're awake before the bells, because the dough doesn't care about sleep schedules. You stretch, roll your shoulders, and breathe in that heavy, yeasty perfume that never really leaves your clothes anymore. The loaves you left to rise overnight have swelled beautifully, round and proud, like they know they've done something right. Thomas stumbles down from the loft, rubbing his eyes, hair sticking up like a bristle brush. "You were right," he yawns. "It smells alive." You grin. "It is alive. You're just late to the miracle." He laughs, still half asleep, and begins dusting the peel with flour. You watch him work, noticing the small things, how he's learned to move slower, gentler, to feel rather than rush. You remember being like that once too, when every loaf felt like a test you might fail. These days you've realized it's less about control and more about companionship. Bread doesn't demand perfection. It demands attention. While Thomas works, your mind drifts to the strange little rituals that fill your days. Every baker has them. You always knock twice on the bench before loading the first loaf. The old man across the street crosses himself with flour dust. One of the nuns from the abbey supposedly hums hymns at her dough to help it rise with grace. Historians still argue whether those rituals were purely superstition or served some subconscious purpose, a rhythm to focus the body, a pause to steady the breath. But you think it's simpler than that. People need meaning. In a world where plagues, taxes, and random church decrees could ruin a life overnight, the tiny, controlled world of a bakery offered something solid. You can't control fate, but you can control how you fold a loaf, and for many that's enough. As the first oven door creaks open, heat floods the room in a glorious wave. It smells like comfort and risk all at once, like the beginning of something that's already halfway gone. The loaves inside shift and crackle, their crusts whispering secrets you'll never quite translate. Thomas crouches to peek inside. "They're perfect," he says softly. "Not yet," you reply. "They're becoming perfect." He tilts his head. "You sound like Father Alain again." You chuckle. "He stole that from me." He rolls his eyes, but the moment lingers. You both watch the color deepen, the edges darken, the golden hue of satisfaction spreading through the air. The sound of the oven fills the silence, that faint hiss of moisture escaping, the occasional pop of expanding crust. You could listen to that forever. It's strange, though, how bread has started to mean more than food. You've begun noticing how every loaf tells a story. A dense one means the weather turned too cold. A cracked one means you rushed the rest. Each imperfection becomes a confession. One of your customers, a merchant with more coin than sense, once asked, "Why do your loaves never look exactly the same?" You told him the truth, because no two mornings are the same. He didn't quite get it, but Alice, standing nearby, had smiled. You sometimes imagine what bread means to the people who eat it, to the farmers who harvest the grain, its survival, to the nobility, its luxury, to the priests, its symbolism, but to you, to the bakers, it's something almost sacred. The act of turning flour and water into nourishment feels like defiance against emptiness itself. You remember your father saying, "Bread is the one thing the poor can make that the rich still want." He wasn't wrong. There's a quiet power in that, and yet the laws of bread still haunt you. The assize of bread, that damned decree from London in 1266, made sure bakers stayed humble. You've memorized its rules. Every loaf must weigh precisely according to the price of grain that week. Too heavy, and you lose money. Too light, and you risk public humiliation. Historians still argue whether the law protected consumers or simply controlled bakers. Either way, it turned your craft into a game of scales and fear. You can't help smirking at the absurdity. "Imagine," you mutter, "being hanged for making a loaf that's too light." Thomas blinks. "They wouldn't really hang someone for that, would they?" You shrug. "Maybe not hang, but stocks? Public shaming?" The pillory of bread was real. He grimaces. "I'll weigh twice next time." Smart man. The morning rush begins. Townsfolk shuffle in, peasants with rough hands, clerks with quills tucked behind their ears, children clutching coins so tight they leave marks. You and Thomas move like clockwork, slice, wrap, hand over, nod. Each exchange lasts seconds, but it feels strangely intimate, like a heartbeat shared through flour dust. Alice appears near noon, her face dusted white. "Yours rose higher today," she says, pretending not to care. You grin. "Maybe the oven liked me better." She snorts. "Don't flatter yourself. Mine had better crust." Historians still argue about that, you tease. She rolls her eyes and leaves before you can add another joke. By dusk, the bakery is quieter. Only the smell remains. Warm, faintly sweet, lingering in the walls. Thomas dozes by the fire. You sit beside him, tired but content, the kind of exhaustion that feels like completion. You think about the day, the laughter, the rising loaves, the subtle triumphs no one else will ever notice. You think about how much effort goes into something that disappears by nightfall, eaten, forgotten, replaced. And yet, that's the beauty of it. Bread doesn't last, but the act of making it does. It's a rhythm older than kings, older than law. Every baker who's ever lived has shared this same strange heartbeat. Wake, knead, bake, rest, repeat. Maybe that's the real perfection everyone's been chasing. Not the flawless loaf, but the eternal cycle, the endless chance to try again. As the last embers fade, you close your eyes and listen. The town outside quiets, the ovens cool, and somewhere a distant bell tolls. You let the warmth drift over you one last time and whisper, "Tomorrow." And in that simple word, everything feels complete. Night falls again over the town, and for once the streets are quiet. No shouting merchants, no rumbling carts, no echo of hammer or hoof. Just the soft hiss of cooling stone, the faint hum of crickets outside, and the smell of ash still clinging to your clothes. You lean back against the oven wall, now only lukewarm, and stare at the loaves cooling on the shelf. Their crusts shine faintly in the candlelight, a dozen golden domes waiting for morning. Thomas has already gone home. The bakery, for now, belongs only to you and to the quiet. You let your mind wander. It drifts through everything you've seen, everything you've learned since the first time you burned your hands on a peel. You remember the assize laws, the markets, the endless weighing and worrying. You remember Alice's smirk, the pride in Thomas's first perfect loaf. The faces of townsfolk who would never know the care that went into each bite they took for granted. You think about how this obsession, the quest for the perfect loaf, isn't really about bread at all. It's about control and hope and the illusion that somewhere in the small details of life, perfection might still be possible. The wind outside slips through the cracks of the shutters. It sounds almost like breathing, slow even, like the rhythm of a sleeper beside you. You close your eyes, and the smell of warm yeast becomes something else, memory itself. You imagine the bakers of other lands, far from this town, the Persian men who bake flat rounds in clay ovens, the Chinese street vendors who steam soft white buns, the French apprentices centuries later who fold butter into dough before dawn. None of them will ever meet you. Yet somehow you're all bound by the same invisible thread of patience, hunger, and quiet obsession. Historians still argue whether bread's universality is practical or poetic, whether it spread because grain was easy to store, or because the act of baking fulfills something ancient in us. You prefer the second answer. After all, every civilization has its version of the loaf. Every family, its own story told in crumbs. You stand and walk to the shelf. Each loaf is slightly different, some rounder, some darker, some puffed unevenly. You touch one lightly, still warm, still alive. For a moment, you almost feel the centuries behind you. Roman bakers carving their insignia into loaves before the ovens of Pompeii. Egyptian workers grinding grain beside the Nile. Medieval guild masters lecturing apprentices about fairness and weight. All of them whispering in different tongues the same quiet promise. Do it right. Do it again. And you, one small baker among millions, have kept that promise tonight. You smile. Tomorrow's dough waits in its bowl, already rising, already preparing to repeat the cycle. The perfect loaf will never come, but the pursuit itself, the endless kneading and waiting, the careful touch, the small joy when the crust splits just right, that's the real perfection. You take one loaf in your hands and tear it open. The crust crackles softly. Steam curls into the air, fragrant, glowing faintly in the candlelight. You taste it, just a corner, and let the warmth spread through your chest. Simple, honest, enough. You sit again, back against the cooling bricks, eyes half closed. Outside the town sleeps, dreaming of fields and harvests, of love and debt, of everything that fills the long middle of life. You think about how the obsession for perfection, for the flawless weight, the precise golden hue, might have begun as fear, but became something gentler, a meditation, a language without words, a way for restless hands to find stillness. The dough will rise again tomorrow. So will you. Now, as the last candle flickers, your thoughts slow. Your breath evens out. The bakery hums softly with the ghosts of countless loaves before yours. The world, for this small moment, feels balanced. The scales righted, the bread cooling, the night forgiving. You whisper, "Good night, old friend," to the oven and close your eyes. The air grows still. The sound of the town fades. All that remains is the faint scent of baked bread and the steady rhythm of your breathing, the simplest, oldest lullaby in the world. Wind down, 300 words. And now, as the story quiets, you feel your own breath mirror that rhythm, slow, steady, familiar. The oven's warmth has faded, but its comfort lingers in the air, wrapping around you like the last trace of sunlight, before evening turns fully to night. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell sighs once, low and tired, marking the hour no one's awake to count. You imagine the streets beyond, the shutters closed, the cobblestones glistening faintly under moonlight. Not a soul moving, only the hush of the world at rest. It's easy in moments like this to forget the noise of the day, the rush, the striving, the endless measuring of worth and weight. Tonight, all of that softens into something gentler. You've done enough. The dough will wait. You picture the next sunrise, the flour floating like mist, the water poured in slow circles, the hands pressing, folding, shaping. Every motion simple, certain, beautiful. And as you breathe out, you realize that maybe that's what perfection really is. Not a goal, but a rhythm. A small, steady act of care, repeated through the centuries. Let that thought settle with you now. Let it quiet your thoughts the way cooling bread quiets a room. The world outside can keep spinning. For tonight, you're exactly where you're meant to be. The oven hums, the air is warm, and the last thing you smell before sleep is bread. Sweet dreams.